I'm Mike Uyak. I love to try new things, and I've had culinary adventures all around the world as well as right at home. I've had really wonderful food, as well as some really horrible food. I'd like to share some of my adventures with you, and we'll see if I have what it takes to fix whatever goes wrong. This is Recipe Redemption. Hello, and welcome to Recipe Redemption. We've got a lot to talk about this time, so let's just get this out of the way right at the start. The recipe we're going to try today is milk chicken, found in the 1967 edition of the Paul Hamlin recipe cards set. I don't have a photo of the backside of the card, so I'll just show you the recipe as I make it. But there's one thing to discuss right off the bat. The recipe calls for 2 small roasting chickens, about 2.5 pounds. It says that I'm going to assume that's each. But even so, those are pretty small chickens by modern standards, about the size of a Cornish game hen, really. Since the beginning of the 20th century, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in the size of our domestic poultry. This chart that I found from the National Chicken Council shows that in 1925, an average domestic chicken had a market weight of 2.5 pounds and took around 3.5 months to get there. But fast forward to today, and the average bird grows to 6.5 pounds in a little over a month and a half. This is due to a combination of selective breeding and the use of high doses of antibiotics to keep the birds alive and healthy while living an unhealthy, caged and sedentary lifestyle of overeating a high-calorie diet of grains they'd never eat in the wild. We're not going to delve into the ethical, moral, or even nutritional issues around the modern factory farm system or the modern super chicken, or any pros or cons therein. That's a whole other discussion. We just need to make sure that when you're preparing recipes, particularly vintage recipes, but even today, we need to understand when they call for 2 chickens or even 2 chicken breasts, and maybe not specify what size they're asking for like they do in this recipe, that we read that recipe critically and decide for ourselves what the actual amount of meat they're looking for. I've brought home packages of chicken breasts that had to have come from a pterodactyl, or at least a decent sized turkey, because the breasts were nearly 3 pounds each. The chicken I'm using today is just north of 5 pounds, so I think it'll do to substitute for the 2 small 2.5 pound chickens called for in this recipe. Another sort of, not really red flag, but another thing to note. It calls for 2.5 cups of water used to boil the 2 chickens. Even if they were game hens put into a smallish pan, 2.5 cups of water is probably not going to cover them. So we're really not boiling them, we're really steaming them. And technically, it's kind of a braise because we're not holding the birds above the boiling liquid. It's actually sitting in the liquid, just not completely submerged. But as you'll see, I'm going to have a hard time calling this a braise, because a braise is supposed to be a flavorful liquid. And, well, you'll see. Problem is, I'm afraid that even with the liquid that's going to come out of the bird, the pan might boil dry. So I'm going to have to manage my heat carefully and keep an eye on it to make sure that doesn't happen. This recipe is super simple. Here I have a chicken in a pot with 2.5 cups of water. And as I mentioned before, it does not cover the bird. 2 stalks of celery. I took the step of chopping it up. You don't really need to, but I did because reasons. Then it just says seasonings. Doesn't tell you what, doesn't tell you how much. So I have about a half teaspoon each of salt, pepper, garlic powder, and onion powder. This is a really plain dish, so that seems about appropriate. Then just cover, bring to a boil, then turn down, and let it simmer slowly for 1 hour. After that hour, pull the chicken out, set it aside, and while the broth is still slowly at a boil, add 1¼ cups of milk mixed with 2 tablespoons of flour, and I'm adding about half of it right at the start. After a little bit, add 2 tablespoons of butter and the rest of the milk and flour mixture, into which I've also whisked an egg yolk. Then it says to just continue cooking for a few minutes until thickened. I ended up cooking it for a lot longer because it never really thickened the way that I wanted it to. So I parted off one of the breasts of the chicken. I only wanted to make 1 serving of this. So, and the recipe says to strain the sauce over the bird. You don't want any of those bits of chicken and celery to ruin the nice smooth coating that you're supposed to make. This never got as thick as the picture showed, especially since you serve this warm. It doesn't have a chance to congeal into that nice thick opaque layer, but you know, we persevere and carry on. They suggest serving this with bananas and sliced eggs. Oh, you heard me. Bananas and sliced eggs, and with a side of potatoes. I didn't do the potatoes, but the bananas are coming. I checked over this several times to make sure that I followed the directions. The proportions are exactly as written. And this sauce, it's basically kind of like a gravy. It does coat, but it's nowhere near that, you know, sort of glossy layer that you see in the photo. Is it possible that modern chickens are juicier than in yesteryear? It's possible. I don't know when the practice started, but a lot of modern chickens are what they call plumped, and they don't necessarily say that on the package. They will inject a brine solution into the bird before packaging that makes it juicier and a little bit more oven proof, so it's a little bit tiny bit more difficult to overcook it. More importantly, it makes it heavier so they can charge you more. But if you ever see a package of chicken and it says water added, that's what has happened. They've actually injected it with brine. And so you're paying for salt water, partially. But anyway, let's try the milk chicken. No. It's boiled chicken. The sauce, whatever seasonings that you choose to add to this are going to add to the flavor. The chicken stock is nice. Obviously, the cream and the egg and butter add some richness to the sauce. Texture of the sauce notwithstanding, it's still really plain. It's not bad. It's not great. It's still plain boiled chicken in a creamy sort of gravy, chicken gravy. I've certainly eaten worse things, but it's a little boring. Also, I was so worried about the sauce that I totally forgot about eating it with the banana. So, here's the milk chicken with the banana. The banana's a weird direction to go in. It's not bad because the chicken and the chicken infused cream sauce that you put on top of it is pretty bland. The banana also being a little bland adds just a little bit of fruitiness, just a little bit of starchiness to it. It's not offensive. It's just kind of a strange direction to take it from my 21st century viewpoint. Obviously, back in the day, banana producers were pushing heavily for people to come up with new ideas for how to use their products so they could sell more. So they encouraged people to put bananas into savory recipes. Let us not forget the experience of the ham and bananas hollandaise that started off this whole YouTube channel. So there are worse things that you can do with a banana. Get your mind out of the gutter. But there are also better things that you can do with a banana. So let's talk about this dish. I believe this is an attempt at an older dish known as chaudfroid chicken. See how that's spelled down below. That I have absolutely no evidence for this, but I suspect someone was trying to Americanize this dish because some folks either were intimidated by any dish with a French name and thus was fancy and probably impossible for a home cook to replicate, quote unquote, until Julia Child came around and showed them that was ridiculous, or because they believed French dishes were too snooty. Chaudfroid, literally hot cold, is a sauce preparation for cold dishes that creates a smooth, almost shell of a sauce by thickening a velouté sauce with gelatin. In fact, let's just do that and see how it differs.
Okay, you've seen me make a bechamel before, so while I cook, we can talk about the history of chaudfroid. Apparently, the Marshal or Duke of Pinay-Luxembourg, sometime around 1759, had thrown a lavish dinner party, but midway through got called away by the king's council. Upon his return much later, the party having finished hours beforehand in his absence, he was hungry and demanded his cooks prepare him a single dish. And they had some cold chicken in which the juices had gelled, and they gussied this up a bit and presented it to him. Now, we've all been there, standing there eating cold gelatinous chicken in the light of the moon through the window and the single refrigerator light bulb through the open door. And in that moment, that bite of sustenance gnawed straight off the bone is the best tasting thing you've ever had. By the light of day, it's plain, paltry, positively prosaic, but now, manna from heaven. So too, the Duke proclaimed it delicious and told them to make it again the next night, exactly as before, and named it chaudfroid. Over the centuries, the dish has been refined and tinkered with, and now the term chaudfroid refers specifically to the sauce, within or beneath which any number of things might reside. It serves as a blank canvas on which other thickened sauces, cooked vegetables, or even edible flowers might be placed for fancy decorations. I think of it kind of like fondant, that stretchy sort of marzipan-like covering for fancy cakes that gives you a smooth, slightly firm surface for decorating. And here's the other breast from that boiled chicken, over which I am going to slowly spoon my chaudfroid sauce. Just let that kind of cascade over and create a nice even coat. And you can see how thick this is. This actually will coat and cover what you pour it onto. Refrigerate for at least 15 minutes and then serve.
Now that I think of it, classic chaudfroid with plain chicken in the middle is still pretty plain. I'll be honest, plain chicken breast is about the most boring thing that I can personally think of. When I get a breast piece with fried chicken, I'm tempted to just eat the crunchy fried skin and save the breast to chop up and use elsewhere, because even if it's not dry and overcooked, and as it often is, it's just not interesting enough to eat the whole thing, not on its own. And slathering it in a sauce that is itself flavored by chicken stock is only going to help so much. You still have a whole chicken breast. or in the case of this original recipe, a whole chicken underneath it. But what if you did something to help make that chicken more flavorful? I got to thinking about this last night, and I thought, this is a pretty easy preparation, all things considered. You boil the chicken, you make a sauce, slather it on top, ta-da! Cold dish, just making this plastic sauce, and it allows you to decorate it if you feel like it. We want it to be tasty, but still without a lot of effort. Maybe make something that looks fancier and harder to make than it really is. Something you could whip up as a sort of a nice meal for someone you don't really care to put that much time into cooking for. Maybe as a consolation for some misfortune that you're secretly kind of enjoying witnessing. Behold, for those of you who stuck with me through that stretch of linguistics and imagination, the sorry, not sorry dish of the 21st century, chicken schadenfreude. See what I did there?
So to start off with, I have the sort of shredded dark meat from the thighs and legs for that boiled chicken, adding a generous pinch of salt, some garlic and onion powder because I put that in everything, some leftover cooked rice. I'm putting probably about a cup and a half at this point here, and just sort of break that up. And you might have heard my microwave going off in the background. So while I add some basil, I'm going to grab some softened chev, some goat cheese, which I think is going to give a nice tanginess and the creaminess that I need to kind of bind everything together. Mix well. It's going to take a moment, so let's time warp here. There. Nice and mixed up. Then I prepare a plate with a ring mold, and I don't actually have a ring mold, but I have this square cutter that Chris has left over from cooking school. Pack the mixture in, not too tight, but so it fills in all the edges. Then remove the mold and spoon on my Schadenfreude. And again, you know, just let it cascade over the sides. Make sure all the sides are covered. And if you're somehow able to do this on a wire rack, it makes it a little easier to kind of clean up. But I refrigerated this for 15 minutes and then took it out and trimmed the edges and transferred it to a clean plate.
The final result? My chicken schadenfreude. And ultimately, it is basically chicken salad. Let's see how it tastes with the Schadenfreude sauce on top. That slight sourness from the goat cheese, a little bit of toothiness from the rice, nice chunks of chicken, and the Schadenfreude, it is kind of like you ever have a spoonful of cold gravy that's kind of congealed? It's like that, but more so. Because you've actually added gelatin to this, it's firmer. It's not quite like fondant, the cake decoration that I likened it to, but it performs much the same function. It is still quite soft, but it's like you sort of frosted it with like a spreadable cheese, but because it was, when it was warm, it was still pourable. It's easier to put onto something like this that might actually fall apart if you were to actually slather on something a little more aggressively, like you would with like a cake frosting or something. A little bit of herbal notes. Now for the decoration, I actually put a couple of just lines of that truffle hot sauce that I happen to have. I thought that the mushroominess of the truffle sauce would pair well. I think actually a little bit of truffle oil into the chicken mixture wouldn't be bad either, but that little bit on top, tanginess of some capers and the additional basil that I put on top just for garnish, it all kind of ties together. It's actually really good. I'm quite pleased with this. Probably tinker with the recipe a little bit more. Maybe even I'm kind of going back and forth on whether or not the center needs any more creaminess to it than just the goat cheese. Like if I maybe a tablespoon of mayonnaise in there, but probably not. I don't think it really needs it. Maybe a little bit more acid just to balance things out. Just a little squeeze of lemon juice, and probably the zest of a lemon would benefit from that as well. That's quite delicious. So I will definitely be playing with this recipe for future dinner parties or whatnot, or in the case of Schadenfreude, if I want to make a quick dish for somebody who I don't really care about all that much, but still feel obligated to feed. This is pretty simple. If you happen to have cooked chicken around, chicken breast, or in this case dark meat, whatever, some chicken, some cooked rice, or you can cook rice in the microwave. Obviously it's not as good as in a real rice cooker or the pilaf method or whatever, but you can do it. So you can make this dish, and while you're waiting for the rice to cook, you make the velouté sauce and add gelatin to it, because surely you have that in your pantry. You can probably throw this together in about a half an hour, 45 minutes if you include the refrigeration time. Not a whole lot of work, and it's actually quite tasty. And then, once you have the Schadenfreude applied, refrigerated down, and then you can actually trim it. If you do this on a wire rack, then you can coat whatever it is you're coating with the Schadenfreude and then transfer it to a plate for presentation. I didn't do that, so as a result I actually had to trim around the edges of my little square here, and then use a spatula to sort of scoop up the nice neat square and place it onto another plate for presentation here. But if you really don't care, then you don't even bother with that step. But yeah, I'm definitely going to be making this again, because it's excellent. So, what do you think? What do you think about cold chicken anyway? But would you prepare it this way? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, do all the internet things. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and share with friends and family. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and any other ideas that you might have for recipes that I should try. So until next time, I'm Mike Uyak for Recipe Redemption. Thanks for watching.